Baldur's Gate was BioWare's first ever RPG. Despite BioWare's lack of experience with the genre, Baldur's Gate nails many of the RPG basics that threaten to be lost to history, as RPGs and action games blend into one incoherent mess of unnecessary skill trees and loot grinds. Most notably, Baldur's Gate manages to tell a clear and complete story within the game without relying on a wealth of lore for things to make sense. If you want additional information on the founding of Baldur's Gate or the Land of Arm to the south, then it is there for you to dig into as part of the Forgotten Realms universe. However, you don't need it. Baldur's Gate does an excellent job following the doctrine of what I like to call the separation of story and lore. It's a crucial foundation of good storytelling. Baldur's Gate almost manages another rare feat, and that's keeping the story more grounded than typical save the world narratives. I say almost because right from the start it's made clear that your character is special in a way clearly linked to the identity of your birth father. From the first minutes, Baldur's Gate's story looks like a chosen one story, and sure enough, by the end the stakes are huge. However, the majority of the 50 plus hours it took me to complete Baldur's Gate were spent doing low level adventuring. The toughest enemies you face are powerful mages who are often capable of wrecking your entire party with a few spells. Despite Baldur's Gate being a licensed Dungeons & Dragons game, there are no fights with dragons. Many modern RPGs have narrative inconsistency because your character is simultaneously forced to go on mindless fetch quests to kill 10 goats, and also one of the most powerful people in the world, tasked with stopping an impending threat. Baldur's Gate doesn't have that problem. You never become an all-powerful god, and the story's focus is on a political problem plaguing the Sword Coast and threatening to start a war with the southern nation of Arm. As you can probably tell, I enjoyed most of Baldur's Gate. It isn't consistently strong, mind you. The immersive first act drew me in so much that I wondered why people always bang on about Baldur's Gate 2 when the original is so good. By the end that made a little more sense. The second act is slightly dull, and the conclusion rushes you through story points so quickly it will make your head spin. I'm aware that the sequel is generally considered to be the far superior game, however that doesn't mean you should skip the original. In an ideal world we would all be able to devote the 50 hours to games as historically important as Baldur's Gate, however that isn't realistic, and the point of this series is to narrow down the list slightly and help you decide which ones you want to devote your time to. If you want to avoid spoilers, then the short and simple answer is yes, I do recommend you play Baldur's Gate, even if you're unfamiliar with D&D. In particular, I recommend the enhanced edition that I'm playing in this video. It contains special modes and tutorials for beginners that I'll talk about later, which helps you get up to speed with the rules, or ignore them if you just want the story. Spoilers will be fairly light until I start directly discussing the story, so feel free to keep watching until the time marked on screen now. Baldur's Gate isn't BioWare's first game, that honour belongs to Shattered Steel. However, it is BioWare's first RPG and first mainstream success. BioWare was incorporated in 1995. It was the brainchild of two doctors, Ray Muzica and Greg Zeschuk. Although by the time BioWare was officially incorporated, they had brought on Trent and Brent Oster, who both left soon after, Marcel Zeschuk and Augustine Yip, another doctor. Note that I didn't describe Muzica and Zeschuk as former doctors. Both continued practicing for a few years after forming BioWare, but eventually had to pack it in when the realities of game development took hold. Shattered Steel may not have been a huge hit, but it did well enough that its publisher, Interplay Entertainment, gave BioWare the resources to begin development on a game initially called Battleground Infinity. Battleground Infinity was going to be an MMO of sorts, which back in the mid-90s would have been well ahead of its time. During development it became clear that Battleground Infinity would be a great fit for the Dungeons & Dragons license that Interplay had just acquired, so the name was changed to Baldur's Gate, a city in the world of the Forgotten Realms where Dungeons & Dragons takes place. The AD&D 2nd edition rule set was adopted for combat, and it transitioned over to being a single player game. With Baldur's Gate, BioWare broke new ground in a couple of ways. First, Baldur's Gate was one of the first native Windows games. Perhaps more significantly, Baldur's Gate was created in the now infamous Infinity Engine. My video series on Isometric CRPGs will contain a lot of Infinity Engine games, including Baldur's Gate 2, Planescape Torment and Icewind Dales. Modern CRPGs such as Pillars of Eternity have newer engines which are clearly inspired by the Infinity Engine. In a GDC presentation, Muzica and Zeschuk state that not one person on the Baldur's Gate team had ever made a game before, which makes this all the more remarkable.
You could say on one hand we just kind of made it up because we didn't really know what we were doing much at that time. Nobody on the team had ever made a video game before. Not one person of the 60 people that eventually at launch we had on the team.
Baldur's Gate was a huge hit, selling over 1 million copies in a year and over 2 million in total. Those might not be massive numbers now, but it was a huge deal back then, especially when you consider the relatively depressed market for Western RPGs back in the mid to late 90s. Fast forward to 2009 and Trent Oster, one of those founding members of BioWare, launched a new publisher called Beamdog with the remit to remake the classic Infinity Engine games. Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition, which is the version I played, was released in 2012 on Windows and iOS, coming to Steam and Android shortly after. The Enhanced Edition is much more than just an HD update, not that the transition to HD was easy. It probably won't surprise you to hear that an important Baldur's Gate data tape was lost in a garage flood, given that this seems to be the cause of 90% of lost video game history if my anecdotal evidence is anything to go by. The Beamdog team reverse engineered Baldur's Gate as much as possible. After the painstaking process of getting the assets, Beamdog realised that not all of them could be up-res to 1080p. One example cited by Beamdog's lead designer Philip Daigle in an interview with Nathan Grayson of Kotaku was that of a cobblestone street. Daigle states that the street was, quote, just a close-up picture of coffee beans and they just repeated over and over again. In 98 you had a 15-inch CRT, so you're not going to notice or care probably. Nowadays when you've got an HD screen you're like, oh, those are coffee beans. We had to render out new streets and then lay them into the original 2D art and then paint over it, end quote. In addition to the HD update, Beamdog also added quality of life updates that I can't imagine playing Baldur's Gate without. My favourite is the quick item pickup bar that lets you see all items close by and pick them up by clicking them in the quick menu instead of separately going up to each dead enemy and clicking on their loot, only to find they have the same short sword as everyone else. I spent a good 10 hours playing with this because I somehow managed to forget about it between my second and third attempts at playing Baldur's Gate. I've no idea how. A close second is the quick save button tied to the Q key, which my finger hovered over the entire time. You can also highlight nearly all interactable items in the area by holding tab. This cuts out some of the pixel hunting from the original, so it's now easier to find hidden items in trees, which can make a big difference to the early game. I'm sure this option has its detractors, but I'm a fan. It's not like those hidden objects will now jump out at you, and they still tend to be tucked out of the way enough that it constitutes a reward for exploring. The highlight option also shows you the names of people nearby or gives them generic labels such as commoner, which makes it easier to know who you should bother talking to. Strangely, holding tab doesn't always highlight doors, including when this feature would be most useful, such as when a door is not visible on screen. Stairs can also be easy to miss in certain environments, and I spent a ridiculously long time looking for the entrance to the sewers until I noticed what I think is supposed to be a tiny set of stairs leading down, or they might just be coffee beans. One quest leads you to a potential companion, Dinir, who is at the bottom of a pit. The stairs look like part of the scenery, but you can walk down them, something it took me an embarrassing amount of time to realise. Other minor changes include the ability to zoom in and out slowly with the mouse wheel and improvements to inventory management such as better item stacking, which is apparently based on the system in Baldur's Gate 2. Speaking of inventory management, I have no idea how anyone plays this game without the bags for holding loads of potions, scrolls and gems. Keep an eye out for these, Baldur's Gate would be a nightmare without them. Being an enhanced edition, you'd expect many of the original's bugs to be cleaned out, and most of them probably are, but there are still plenty left in. Baldur's Gate crashed roughly once every 4 hours, which is far too often for a game that at its core is 20 years old at this point. Even the enhanced edition has been out for more than 5 years. After writing the first draft of this script, Beamdog put out a huge new patch which, according to the patch notes at least, has cleared up some minor complaints I had, a few of which were in my initial script. Still, I can't guarantee that all the bugs have been removed, so be sure to save regularly. The patch is also supposed to fix an annoying issue with the music that pops up during fights. It has a tendency to continue long after the fight is finished, including over the voice acting for NPCs.
You handled yourself well. As a rule, I do not rely on those who fight.
Pathfinding is still terrible at times. One or two of my companions often got lost or would just refuse to move with the others even though I'd used the select all command. The team would try to head down dead ends at times, although they would often realise their mistake and correct themselves. Pathfinding becomes most tedious in the dungeons with narrow paths. If you're not incredibly careful in how you select the destination, the game might think you're trying to place 5 characters next to each other and one just the other side of the wall, which given the maze-like nature of these sections means that the character will often end up taking a completely different route. Strangely, pathfinding can even be an issue on the overworld map. About halfway through the game you need to travel from Cloakwood Mine to the city of Baldur's Gate. You're forced to travel in a roundabout fashion, which makes sense because you had to take a specific route to get there. Doing this puts you in loads of tough random encounters, which isn't ideal. However, if you choose to first go to a location near Baldur's Gate and then move north from there, you can do so with barely any delay. Companion AI has issues in combat as well. I had my companions set up to attack on sight, and they did. However, ranged combatants would often stand around after defeating the nearest enemy instead of pushing on and taking out the rest of the pack. The Enhanced Edition isn't a perfect version of Baldur's Gate. The little quality of life tweaks make a big difference to the experience for newcomers, but probably aren't enough by themselves to pull in those who are already well versed with the original. Well, that's where the extra content comes in. There's a new mode called the Black Pit, which puts you in an increasingly challenging set of battle arenas. I barely touch this mode, it's not what I play these games for, but I'm sure there's an audience for it. And then there's Beamdog's most controversial addition to Baldur's Gate, new characters and story content within the main game itself. The new characters are Nero, Dawn and Rasad. one for each of the good, neutral and evil alignments. The only one I spent any major time with was Nero. You meet her early on when she is attacked by some red wizards. This used to be an unavoidable encounter, however that new patch I mentioned apparently makes this optional. Nero is a wild mage who is seen as a danger due to her unpredictable magic. As a companion, she'll occasionally talk about her past and ask you to help her with a lengthy side quest with the goal of eventually controlling her power. In theory, the new content is a perfect fit for modern day BioWare's MO, namely characters with their own side stories who also happen to be romanceable. The thing is, these additions aren't in keeping with the BioWare that made Baldur's Gate. The original Baldur's Gate companions had an initial task they'd like your help with, however it was often generic and something you'd likely do anyway. There's also little in the way of character development for companions. For example, you meet Jaheira and Khalid early on at the Friendly Arm Inn. They are both eager to get to Nashkel and remind you about it if you delay. Nashkel just so happens to be where you need to go anyway, so it isn't much of a side quest. Other characters ask you to clear out bandit camps and the like. This wouldn't be a problem if the companions felt connected to the side quest in question, but you rarely get any development at all once the quest is complete. These quests often feel like glorified tutorials, giving a guiding hand to new players who might be a little lost with all the wilderness to explore and the lack of direction. Beamdog's new characters have much deeper side quests, and everything is fully voice acted, whereas the original conversations between companions usually weren't. In other words, the new stuff really stands out. Quality wise, I don't believe the new stuff is any worse than the original content, although I don't believe it improves things much either. The new writing feels a little more modern and perhaps lacks some of the tongue-in-cheek charm of the original, but some of the vitriol I've seen for the new content is a touch extreme. I mean, come on, the most memorable line from the original is a man yelling orders to a space hamster. We need to lighten up a bit.
You're catching a bad case of death.
From a game preservation standpoint, it does feel a touch odd that we can't play the Baldur's Gate story without the new content. This is all highly subjective of course, but there seems to be a big difference between patching bugs, adding a separate game mode and making quality of life changes, compared to adding in new story content which tries to blend in seamlessly with the original. I played the entire game with a companion who didn't even exist in the original, and for better or worse that will always be part of my impression of the game. However, all that said, maybe we wouldn't have got the enhanced edition at all if it weren't for the new content. It's a selling point for those who have the original, which already has mods to remove many of the bugs and add resolution options. I also understand the desire of developers to stretch their creative muscles a bit, something we'll see more of with Siege of Dragonspear. It's an open secret that Beamdog wants to make Baldur's Gate 3, and this new content is likely a test run to prove they have the writing chops to do it justice. Last but not least is the major addition that makes Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition an easy game to recommend regardless of your experience with D&D. There's a story mode where you cannot die in combat. I'm going to talk more about it later, but if you don't like the sound of the dice rolls behind combat in Baldur's Gate, then just know that you don't have to worry about it all that much. Story mode is not how I'd recommend you play the game, but I can't blame people for wanting to skip all the complications, especially when even the create a character screen is daunting to newcomers. And by newcomers I am including myself, because I stared at these screens for a long time and still didn't entirely understand the consequences of my choices. I blame my first abandoned 30-hour attempt on the choices I made on these initial screens. Everything starts off innocently enough with a gender selection that makes absolutely no difference to your character. Then you choose your race, which takes a little more thought. You can be human, elf, half-elf, dwarf, halfling, gnome and half-orc. Human is the least interesting with no special attributes as such. It's basically the default race. Elf and half-elf are similar, with both having advantages with bows and certain swords, resistance to some magic and abilities typically suited to rogues or thieves. Dwarves, halflings and gnomes have beneficial saving throws, more thief skills and adjustments both positive and negative to key attributes like wisdom and dexterity. Orcs have bonuses to strength and constitution with corresponding decreases to intelligence. I strongly suspect most people will go with human, but if you want to play as a rogue then you might want to be more adventurous. Next up you pick your class, and this is where things get really confusing. Apologies for all the lengthy lists, but I want to give you some idea of just how many choices there are. If you play as a human, the race which has the most class options, you can play as a fighter, ranger, paladin, cleric, mage, thief, bard, sorcerer, monk or shaman. Other races are limited in what they can choose. Once again there is a default class of sorts, which is the fighter. Other classes are restricted in what they can wear and wield in combat, with certain weapon proficiencies attempting to keep things balanced. Through my various playthroughs I tried out mage, thief and fighter, which were the classes I had a decent grasp of through other RPGs. The footage you will see in this video is of a fighter. I'm sure the other classes have their admirers, but they look more appropriate for veterans of the series who know what they're doing. Speaking of needing to know what you're doing, after choosing your class you need to choose your class kit, which is perhaps akin to a subclass. I spent ages on this screen and eventually ended up choosing a subclass of fighter for my fighter. I know it's boring, but my character is a human fighter. Don't worry, I'm not going to list every possibility because that would be tedious even by the standards of my videos. I'll just give some examples coming from the human choices. You can be a human paladin undead hunter, a human mage illusionist, a human cleric priest of Talos, or a human monk of the Sun Soul faction. Your choice of class kit helps you make some incredibly specific choices for your character, which again is great if you have a clue what to expect going forward. A human fighter who picks the Berserker class kit gets the once a day ability to rage, but can't specialise in ranged weapons and must be of a non-lawful alignment. Choosing the Kensai class kit gets you a bonus to your armour class, but prohibits you from wearing armour. You might like the sound of that compromise, or you might not know what the hell armour class is at this point. Baldur's Gate, like many games from the 90s, made the not entirely unreasonable assumption that you would have read the manual before playing. You then choose your alignment of lawful good, chaotic evil, or somewhere in between. This affects your starting reputation in towns. All companions you meet have an alignment of their own. If you act evil around someone who is good, they will likely kick up a fuss and may eventually leave the party. Next is the ability screen, which gives you a random amount of points to allocate based on dice rolls. I suppose in theory you should go with the first number you're given, but there's a handy little re-roll button right there, so you could just try 2, 3, 400 times until you get a nice high number around 90. I would prefer a system with a set number of points to allocate, although the ability to effectively choose the total number adds in another way for you to control the experience, by making life slightly easier or harder on yourself. Each attribute is capped at 18, although strength goes up to 18.99. Most of this is self-explanatory. Strength is melee attacks and carrying capacity, dexterity is ranged attacks and thieving, intelligence is for spells, wisdom is for clerics, and charisma plays a role in dialogue checks. Finally, you pick your skills. Again, new players are flailing around in the dark here because you don't know what good gear you're going to find or when. My approach on an earlier playthrough was to focus points on swords and the sword and shield style. During that playthrough I found a great early armour set and some excellent morning stars, which made the sword and shield largely unnecessary. When starting another new character, I took that knowledge and focused on the morning stars and 2 weapons attack style. This decision needn't be make or break for your playthrough so long as you don't do something stupid. Probably not a good idea to specialise in 2-handed swords in combination with the sword and shield style, for example. The only challenging part is knowing what good gear you're likely to find and what gear your companions will end up having. That's another advantage of picking the morning stars, because my companions of choice don't use them and therefore I don't have to share the good loot. Likewise, my protagonist wouldn't need a shield, which freed them up for my companions, who would only hurt themselves if given a morning star. Combat is governed by the 2nd edition rule set of D&D. I'm going to take a shot at explaining how it works so that those of you who are as clueless as me about this stuff can at least vaguely understand what you're looking at in the video. It's not all that complicated if you take a bit of time to study the rules, however a couple of bizarre terms and rules are front loaded, which likely has people flipping on story mode before they've even left the introductory village. Let's start with THAC0, which perhaps more accurately would be pronounced THAC0. It stands for 2-hit armor class 0. Your character's THAC0 is the number they need to roll on a 20-sided die to hit an enemy with an armor class of 0. That begs the question, what is armor class? Just think of that as armor quality. The odd bit is that you want both THAC0 and armor class to be as low as possible. It makes sense when you think of how the two numbers interact, but it's counterintuitive for something like armor to be stronger when the number is lower. A quick example might help. Let's say you have a THAC0 of 16 and an armor class of 3. You're fighting an enemy with a THAC0 of 18 and an armor class of 7. You need a roll of at least 9 on a d20 to get a hit. Your opponent needs a roll of at least 15. Regardless of THAC0 and armor class, a roll of 20 will always be a hit. There's nothing overly complicated about this, but the interface and in-game explanations do more to confuse than help. As we've seen, certain types of character get bonuses to THAC0 and armor class. Likewise, certain weapons, armour and accessories will adjust THAC0 and armour class, either for all attacks or certain types such as piercing attacks. Given that a lower THAC0 and armour class is always better, you'd expect items that improve these stats to be a negative number, such as -1 to THAC0. However, it's actually the other way round. If you want to improve your THAC0 by 1 to move it from 16 to 15, then you need to equip an item that gives you a +1 to THAC0, or an item that has a higher positive attribute than your existing piece. For example, you could replace a +3 piece with a +4 piece. THAC0 is off-putting to newcomers, but it isn't complicated once you understand how the game is presenting the numbers. It gets easier from here on out. Well, kind of. The D&D rules can get insanely complicated if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of each number, every dice roll, and the interactions between spells, buffs, status effects and the like. But an understanding of THAC0 is enough for you to complete Baldur's Gate on normal difficulty. After rolling the d20 and determining whether or not an attack has landed, you then calculate the damage, which is dependent on the weapon, with varying types of dice used to calculate an attack number. While the UI does a bad job presenting the information for newcomers, I have to give BioWare and Beamdog credit for including plenty of tutorials and guidance in the early stages. In the original game you start off in Candlekeep with incredibly basic quests such as finding items for hungover guards and helping a sick cow. NPCs strongly encourage you to complete training scenarios such as fighting while dealing with a surprise attack from an archer or handling multiple enemies. There are also scholars dotted around Candlekeep to explain the rules and user interface. Beamdog took it one step further and introduced a new tutorial section before you even start a campaign, teaching you to use different classes of character so that you're not completely confused when you pick up a thief and don't know what to do when faced with a trap. I'm not convinced it's actually possible to gradually ease players into the D&D rule set in one game without completely ruining the pacing, but I appreciate both developers' attempts at trying. With melee fighters you can pretty much set and forget. They'll head into battle and deal as much damage as possible while soaking up whatever the enemy has to throw at them. The real creativity comes in with spellcasters like Jaheira and Nero. Baldur's Gate has an insane amount of spells to choose from. The really good stuff is saved until you've leveled up a bit, but even at level 1 you can cast spells such as Sleep and Magic Missile. This isn't as exciting as summoning monsters to fight alongside you or turning your skin to stone, but mages are certainly useful from the get-go. Mages also take the most skill and patience to use efficiently. You typically have to keep them out of danger, which is easier said than done when the AI is seemingly tasked with treating them like suicidal redshirts. Even if they do stay at the back of the pack, you have to worry about them casting area of effect spells such as fire, toxic or webs, which can affect your team as well as the enemies. In any halfway challenging encounter you should take personal control of your mages to stop them doing more harm than good. When used correctly, mages can make the toughest encounters into a snooze fest, literally. There's nothing quite like having your mage cast a sleep spell and then beating people to death while they sleep. Toxic clouds deal serious damage without having to get close to the enemy, but keeping your own team out of the clouds is more challenging than it should be. It's also nigh on impossible to know the exact area of effect for these spells. The description gives you information like the AoE being 40 feet, but that isn't particularly helpful. I struggle to gauge distance in real life. When a foot in this context is about 3.5 pixels, it becomes even more challenging. It might look a little cheap, but a marker showing the area your spell will hit would have been incredibly helpful. Given unlimited attempts, mages could keep spamming spells until one of them worked and make your party practically unbeatable. RPGs usually limit spell usage to a mana system that needs to be replenished either by waiting for cooldown timers to expire or through the use of consumables. Baldur's Gate takes a different approach by giving mages a carrying capacity of sorts. Spells have a level and each mage or cleric can only carry a certain amount of spells at each level. If you want to cast a spell more than once, then you'll need to have that spell take up multiple slots. Once you've used up a spell, you won't get it back until you rest. Likewise, you can't change up your deck of spells until you sleep. I believe this is part of the D&D rule set, so this isn't intended as a criticism of BioWare, just an observation that perhaps this system doesn't work so well out of the typical D&D setting. I'd have preferred a typical AP or mana system. Planning out your spells before a battle is fine if you know what type of battle is coming up. If you know you're going to be fighting mages who like to cast fear spells, then stock up your inventory with resist fear spells. The problem comes when you don't know what you're going to face, which is most of the time. You can try to stock a wide variety of spells, but you can't possibly prepare for every eventuality. This meant I was often fighting without the spells that could have made light work of encounters. The alternative of course is to quick save before each encounter and load up again once you know what spells you'll need. Take a quick nap and you'll be good to go. This is a feasible but not at all satisfying way of playing. To be clear, you don't need to do that often. For most encounters, a decent mix of spells will get you through just fine. However, there were a lot of major encounters that I simply couldn't get through without leaving and coming back again with a refreshed spell inventory. This is perfectly within the rules, it just doesn't feel within the spirit and becomes a slippery slope. Once you get into the habit of planning for major encounters, it becomes easy to expect perfection for each fight. If you win but get a beating, why not just reload a save and make better use of your knowledge of the enemy's skill sets? You also need to keep identify spells handy to use on magical items you find. If not, you might find yourself equipping cursed items that you can't remove. You can identify items at temples, but there aren't that many of them and you usually want to know what sweet gear you found straight away. There's a fine line between learning and cheesing, and I'm not entirely sure I always stay on the right side of it. Occasionally I would decide to stick with what I had and try to push through in the spirit of role-playing, and then I would come across an enemy that felt like a puzzle encounter specifically designed to make you leave and come back later with the correct spells. The best example of this is the Basilisks. If you fight these guys with a full party, at least one member of that party will get turned to stone, probably two. If that person happens to be your protagonist, then it's game over. Otherwise, you can always come back later with a stone to flesh scroll or a spell to bring the companion back to life. That's clearly a hassle, and besides there's likely to be more than one basilisk to fight anyway. The solution is to have a mage cast protection from petrification to prevent your team being petrified, assuming that the mage has that in their spell inventory. Without their main attack, the basilisks are pretty useless, so you only need to send in one person to deal damage once you're properly protected. I would also lure enemies away from the group. This is obviously taking advantage of limited enemy visibility, but they could have been placed in a tighter group if BioWare didn't want us to do that. I see it as similar to distracting enemies by throwing a bottle and watching as one with a death wish goes to investigate. But again, it's a slippery slope. You get situations where you climb a set of stairs and walk into a room full of enemies before quickly nipping back down the stairs with only one enemy choosing to follow, and then repeat and repeat and repeat until they're all dead. This is cheap, I'll admit that much. However, when there is a wizard on the other side who can confuse your entire squad within a few seconds of the fight starting, it often feels like the only way to win. Speaking of those confusion spells, I really wish they would wear off immediately once you've won the encounter. Likewise, for certain traps like webbing, it's tedious to have everyone standing there for a minute with nothing to do while you wait for a timer to tick down. While I clearly had a lot of problems understanding all the systems at play, I eventually managed to complete Baldur's Gate on normal mode with the exception of 2 moments in the expansion that I'll talk about later. If you're also a newcomer, then I'd recommend you start with normal as well, but for the most part you'll also be fine with the core rules option. As a quick rundown, Baldur's Gate has the following difficulty options: easy, normal, core rules, hard, insane and legacy of Baal. Anyone capable of playing on hard, insane or legacy of Baal isn't going to need advice from an amateur like me, so I'll focus on easy, normal and core rules. As mentioned earlier, there's also a story mode. The major difference between the difficulties are in damage dealt by enemies. Core rules is the base difficulty with damage at 100%, normal has 75% and easy has 50%. Easy also has fewer enemies and a luck bonus. The difference in damage received doesn't make as big a difference as you'd expect, especially on the more challenging fights when even at 50% a major enemy will be able to tear your mage to shreds in no time. Likewise, if you get frozen in place, a 50% damage reduction just means your inevitable death takes twice as long. The luck bonus on easy certainly helps, although having fewer enemies just means less opportunity to practice and presumably less XP. Easy isn't a mode you can coast through without understanding what you're doing. While experimenting early in my time with Baldur's Gate, I made some truly terrible parties that got annihilated by basic enemies on easy, largely because I had no idea how to use them. Even on easy, you'll need a basic understanding of Thaco and armor class to make it through. The reason I recommend starting on normal as opposed to easy is that on normal you'll find out a lot quicker whether you actually know what you're doing. With that luck bonus and fewer enemies, it's perfectly possible to push through a couple of early skill checks and be lulled into a full sense of security. It's better to find out you don't understand combat early on, rather than 10 hours into a run once you've already made a complete mess of your party composition. You'd think the same logic would apply to normal mode and make a bump up to core rules worthwhile. I experimented with core rules a fair bit and it's not all that steep a jump. You will lose fights more often, but in my experience, any fight I could get through on normal mode I could also get through on core mode. It might just take a few more tries or extra potions. There's a couple of other reasons why I recommend normal over core mode for newcomers. First of all, companions can die permanently in core mode. In the true spirit of role playing, you should probably let this happen and roll with it, but this was way too common an occurrence for me. In normal mode, companions can be revived on the cheap by visiting a temple. It's still a pain because you have to take the character's inventory and split it between your party and then give it all back when they're revived. Due to the hassle, I'd usually restart fights until I got through without any losses. I pretend to myself that this is just to save the time of visiting a temple and isn't cheating at all. So ultimately, regardless of whether you're playing on core rules or normal, you will probably restart fights if companions die. There are 2 other reasons for sticking to normal that are more important, or at least justify temporary switches to normal. The first is that when you level up under core rules, the amount of HP you gain is determined by a dice roll. Under normal, you get the maximum amount available. This can make a huge difference once you get to level 7+. Finally, under core rules, when mages and clerics write scrolls to their inventory, there is a chance the writing will fail and the spell will be lost. Most spells can be found in multiple locations, but getting a rare spell and then losing it before you even get a chance to use it is not fun. That's why I recommend normal over core rules and easy. As discussed, there is also a story mode where your characters cannot die in combat. You'll make it through every battle without any trouble, although if you don't equip your characters properly then it could take a while, as you watch swing after swing missing or barely doing any damage. At the risk of stating the obvious, story mode is there if you just want to experience the story and don't care about the combat or don't care enough to learn. If I weren't doing an entire video series on CRPGs, then I certainly would have been tempted. As it was, I wanted to learn as much as possible to improve my experience with future games. I'm certainly not going to judge anyone who opts to avoid the nitty-gritty of combat. I didn't find it particularly exciting myself. The sheer variety of spells for mages and clerics made them interesting and varied, but 3 members of my party were largely automated. I could have micromanaged a little more with the melee builds, but never felt the need or desire to do so. On the harder difficulty settings, you need to pause regularly and issue commands to maximise each companion's abilities. Maybe I'll take that approach as I grow more comfortable with these CRPGs and the D&D rule set, but for my first time this was enough. And let's face it, I mainly play RPGs for the story, and Baldur's Gate certainly has a lot going for it in that regard. This is when you should stop watching if you want to avoid story spoilers. You start the campaign in Candlekeep. Your protagonist has a fixed backstory, which I'm not usually a huge fan of, however he or she is still largely a blank slate when it comes to personality traits and potential skill sets, so it's workable. As explained by the deep and foreboding narrator who pops up at the beginning of each chapter, you are a ward of Gorion and have spent all your life in the fortress of Candlekeep. Candlekeep isn't a fortress in the traditional military sense. Instead, it keeps itself isolated from the political intrigues of the Forgotten Realms and works to preserve history in its centrepiece library. Entry is only granted to those who pay with a book of historical importance. Gorion is your father figure and teacher. He imparted decades of wisdom and yet never told you your true heritage. I wonder if that'll be important. After acting suspiciously for a few weeks, Gorion suddenly tells you to prepare to travel outside of Candlekeep with no explanation as to why you need to suddenly uproot your life. He gives you some money to buy supplies, but you can earn a bit more by helping out the locals with the usual assortment of rat killing and fetch quests. These quests are assigned with more than a nudge and a wink towards the fourth wall. Yes, you're doing the same stuff you've done 100 times before, but it's strangely endearing and I was in no rush to leave. When you do finally leave Candlekeep with Gorion, the two of you are attacked by a group who demand that Gorion hand you over. Gorion keeps them busy enough that you're able to escape, but he is killed in the process. If you return to Gorion's body, you'll find a note from a mysterious figure known as E, who tells Gorion that he must leave Candlekeep with his ward immediately and head to the Friendly Arm Inn. You might already be losing interest. This probably sounds like another Chosen One story where you have to save the world while also reuniting children with their lost pets and other random nonsense. There is certainly a disconnect here that I'll discuss more later, but it's worth bearing in mind that Baldur's Gate's story is fairly low-key most of the time. This is best illustrated by the level cap. No matter how many side quests you do and bandits you kill, you won't get higher than level 10, and some character classes can't even get that high. I finished the game at level 7, although the expansion would have got me to level 8 if I'd done that first. Either way, leveling is rare and this isn't an accident. Typically in RPGs, your level is a strong indicator for what level enemies you can and cannot beat in combat. However, it often doesn't bear any relation to the type of enemies you can face. I'm sure you can all think of an RPG that presents a huge beast for you to fight, such as a dragon, that is of relatively low level so you can defeat it early on. Later in the game you go up against small beasts or bandits with a ridiculously high level that technically mean they're many times tougher than the dragon you faced 20 hours ago. You face the same enemies throughout the game but they have a higher level. There's often no reason for these enemies being tougher to kill, they just are. Some games attempt to excuse this by giving them a new name, which perhaps suggests a higher level of armour or more venomous attack, but as players we know the score. We know this is largely nonsense. How can we take on a massive dragon one minute and then the next we die to a spider barely big enough to raise an Australian eyebrow? Baldur's Gate does this a bit but not too much. Enemy levels and your level mean something. For starters, you never fight a dragon in this Dungeons and Dragons game. The closest it gets is with some wyverns. When you're low level you'll be able to deal with gibberlings easy enough, but wild dogs can put up an aggressive fight. Later on those same dogs are a pushover, as they should be. The challenge builds naturally. Large spiders are tough but not insurmountable. They don't just get bigger or change colour as you level up, instead they start using web traps that hold you in place while they attack and poison you. Phase spiders can teleport, which is a nuisance, but when you do land a hit they go down fairly easily. Human enemies stick to similar rules. The difference between a bandit that goes down with one dice roll and one that puts up a fight is the quality of their weapons and armour, the same as with you and your companions. This never becomes absurd. You won't come up against a solitary guard who is capable of wiping out your high level team just because he is considered an endgame guard. To increase the threat of standard human enemies you have the mages, who can make a relatively simple battle impossible by throwing out an early confusion or fear spell. You can have a party of 6 with strong fighters, a powerful mage, a cleric and a rogue pinging arrows from afar, but you never become all powerful. Your protagonist's relative lack of power means you never feel out of place doing the smaller quests. If anything, it's the bigger story arc concerning your parentage that feels like it belongs in another game. You might be destined for something bigger but you don't know what or when, and it doesn't help much when you're facing a pack of angry orcs. Compare this to the likes of Dragon Age Inquisition, when every goat killing quest you take on means delaying the closing of rifts that threaten to bring about the end of the world. You start off needing to defend yourself against threats found in the wild. You then uncover a conspiracy and it develops naturally from there. Or at least it does for most of the game. The third act gets a little chaotic. The first act, however, is incredible and one of the best I've played in a while. When the protagonist meets a new character, you often introduce yourself as an adventurer and you actually feel like one. You spend hours simply exploring the wilderness, picking up side quests and welcoming and rejecting companions. Imoen, a girl you grew up with in Candlekeep, will be most players' first companion, although you are free to go it alone if you like. Regardless of who you travel with, you'll find it impossible to miss discussion around an iron shortage in the region. Bandits are everywhere disrupting iron shipments, and the iron that does make it through tends to be of poor quality, prone to falling apart and hardly suitable for use in weapons and armour. Your own curiosity takes you south to the town of Bergerost, which acts as a home of sorts for the entire adventure. One building is conveniently empty after you kill a bunch of spiders as part of a side quest, so I used it to store the loot that I wasn't ready to sell. Continuing south takes you to Nashkel and then the mines in your first proper dungeon experience. Dungeons are a core part of not just D&D but many RPGs. The Elder Scrolls games are obvious examples, and I'd argue that Fallout also has dungeons, at least in spirit, even if they take the form of building interiors instead. Despite being a core part of RPGs, a genre that I love, I'm not a huge fan of dungeons. I'm a story guy, and RPG combat is usually something I put up with instead of actively enjoy. Dungeons can contain decent stories, and there's an excellent example of that in the Baldur's Gate expansion, however for the most part they consist of narrow corridors and hordes of enemies. The Nashkel mines offer up a bit of story if you talk to the miners, but for the most part it's just a trek through narrow corridors running into dead ends and defeating kobolds. The hardest part is keeping everyone together in corridors that are barely wide enough to contain your party. Once you reach the bottom you meet Mullahay and uncover a little more of the conspiracy. Mullahay can order the kobolds around because he's convinced them he's their god. He instructed the kobolds to poison the iron dug out of the mines. This infected the iron like a plague and is the reason it's all of such poor quality. You have to kill Mullahay, and upon reading his personal letters you find out he is working under the orders of Tazuk. You know a little more about the cause of the iron shortage and have a new lead, but there's still no urgent need to go and save the world. I love how the first act lets you uncover the iron conspiracy by yourself. The prologue felt a little too railroaded, with Gorion making you leave and his prompt death, but after that you were free to do as you will with no major objective to distract you. An iron shortage might not sound all that exciting, however there's enough of a conspiracy vibe about it to draw you in. It's the perfect balance of intriguing story and freeform adventuring for a fantasy RPG. If all of Baldur's Gate were as strong as the beginning until the completion of the Nashkel mines, I'd be dumping more praise on it than critics do for mediocre Nintendo games. The second act though is too long and has you repeating an almost identical scenario to the Nashkel mines. You need to hunt down Tazuk and are told about a bandit camp nearby. I couldn't get close to the bandit camp until I'd levelled up a bit, so I spent a fair few hours exploring the Sword Coast and completing the vast majority of the available side quests. The stakes are higher now that we know about the Iron Plague, and the adventuring that had been so captivating before now started to feel like an unwanted distraction. Once you clear out the bandit camp, Tazuk gives you a lead to a previously inaccessible area called Cloakwood. Eventually you make it to Cloakwood Mine and pretty much repeat the process you did in the Nashkel mines. Cloakwood Mine is under the control of the Iron Throne, which as the name suggests is an organisation that deals in iron. The Iron Throne is using slaves to work the Cloakwood Mine, which most people consider to be inactive, to create their own supply of weapons and armour which are now in short supply. The Cloakwood Mine at least contains the opportunity to make a big decision that will decide the fate of the miners. While not exactly subtle, it was a welcome reminder of the choices that the early Fallout games presented on a regular basis. One of the miners tells you about a plug that could be used to flood the mine on the way out. When further down you can tell another miner about the plan to flood the mine and instruct him to get the miners out. If you're playing a good party then of course you should do this, however if you like you can lie to the first miner and tell him that all the miners have reached safety and get him to pull the plug early, killing everyone down there. It's nice to have options. As with the Nashkel mines you get to the end and find the person in charge, this time a mage called Deveon who points you in the direction of Ryltar. The Cloakwood mine by itself is no worse than the Nashkel mines, in fact it's probably better, but having two mines as consecutive story beats means that the second act suffers through repetition. At least that next lead takes you to the city of Baldur's Gate. It's been there at the top of your map this entire time, and only after 25 plus hours can you finally go there. While there was a little too much meandering for my liking leading up to this, every minute spent outside the city contributes to the awe you feel as you walk over the long bridge for the first time. That's nothing compared to the epic sense of scale from the city itself. Baldur's Gate is massive. Every town you visited so far has fit comfortably into one zone of the map. Baldur's Gate has 9 and that's not including the underground sewers. Baldur's Gate is a city of law and order, so you can largely take a break from fighting for a while and just explore. Perhaps in an attempt to spice things up slightly, you're given 2 side quests that need to be completed within 10 days. The time limits might be to stop you constantly leaving combat and resting in one of the many inns. One quest is you work with the Thieves Guild to steal plans for Halaruan's sky ships. I managed to make a mess of this more than once and had to load a few saves. While force is always an option, killing the targets will be a hit on your reputation, so you're better off sneaking in. You need to pretend to be a cleaner and select the correct dialogue options, and then have your rogue character use invisibility potions to sneak around upstairs and steal the required items. In another quest you're poisoned while you sleep and will die in 10 days unless you get the antidote. This one is completely out of place. Given all the adventures I've been on with my companions, I'd like to think someone couldn't just sneak into our room as we slept to poison me. And why use a 10-day poison instead of just killing me outright? I strongly suspect, with absolutely no proof whatsoever, that this quest was just to give players something to do while exploring the city and before the crazy stuff goes down. It's been a while since the Iron Shortage mystery has gone anywhere, but it's wrapped up quickly in the final act. Gone is the sense of exploration and adventuring, replaced by huge story developments that come one after the other with no time to digest what the hell is going on. The Flaming Fists are the peacekeeping force of Baldur's Gate. One of its members, Scar, introduces you to Duke Elton, leader of the Flaming Fists and one of the 4 Dukes of Baldur's Gate. Elton asks you to investigate the Iron Throne, believing it to be responsible for the Iron Crisis, which you've probably already figured out by this point. Elton gives you a valuable book which can be used to barter your way back inside Candlekeep. Returning to the starting area is another powerful moment in the story. It's likely taken you around 40 hours to reach this point, and Candlekeep was locked off the entire time. In the real world, it's likely been weeks since you've been back here. It's tempting to wander the village and catch up with old friends, but it's hard to resist the lure of the central library that was previously off limits. Inside the library you meet Kvaras, who suggests you should attack the Iron Throne leaders, one of whom is Raltar, who was the boss of Devayorn back at the Cloakwood Mine. Given that we already know Raltar and the Iron Throne are up to no good, it's tempting to take Kvaras up on his word. However, other members of the library think he's been acting weird lately. I found Raltar and his Iron Throne buddies and promptly killed them before being arrested soon after. Even if you don't kill them, you end up getting arrested, so it's probably mandatory, especially considering the information dump you get from Tethril just before you're teleported to the catacombs. Kvaras is actually a man called Saravok, which when spelled backwards is Kvaras. Saravok has been manipulating everyone, crippling the iron supply and setting bandits loose with the end goal of starting a war between the Sword Coast and the Nation of Arm to the south. He's spreading rumours in both nations that the other party is preparing for war and is responsible for the Iron Crisis, just waiting for the right time to light the match. Oh, and Saravok is the one who killed Gorion, and he's been after you this entire time. Instead of killing you outright, he's now decided to frame you as an agent of Arm who murdered the Iron Throne leaders as part of a mission to spread chaos throughout the Sword Coast. To be fair, in my case he was right about the murders. Once in the catacombs you come across familiar faces including Gorion, who tries to convince you that he survived the attack after all. He didn't, it's a doppelganger. I'd already seen doppelgangers during a side quest back in Baldur's Gate. They'd taken over the Merchants League in order to make terrible decisions to help Saravok. What I don't know is how long these doppelgangers were in place. I did wonder whether my interactions during the prologue might have been with doppelgangers, however I don't believe this is the case. It would appear that the doppelgangers down in the catacombs plan to take over from those above ground but haven't done so yet. You eventually escape and head back to Baldur's Gate to gather evidence in a desperate attempt to prove that Saravok is behind the Iron Crisis before war breaks out. Being an escaped convict, you can't exactly wander the streets freely this time. With hindsight, this is one of the more interesting parts of the game, however the experience of actually playing it was painful. If the Flaming Fist mercenaries spot you, they will arrest you. You can fight them, but you take a hit of 10 to your reputation, which is huge, plus they are innocent after all. If they arrest you, then you're quickly found guilty in a trial and placed in the underground prisons. You can escape these easily by answering a riddle from another prisoner who just casually happens to have a key on him. From this point on, everyone will be after you, and unless you're still killing guards, you're going to have a rough time. What I didn't realise initially is that you can avoid being arrested. I assumed this content was mandatory, but it's not, and life will be a lot simpler if you never get caught. So how do you manage that? The secret is to use the sewers to get where you need to go without being seen. For me, this meant constantly entering and exiting sewers until I lucked out and came above ground where I needed to be. All in all, it took me hours to gather the evidence I needed and get some invitations to the palace, where I had to convince the Grand Dukes of Saravok's guilt. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here. You meet a former lover of Saravok who wants you to spare his life, and the Shadow Thieves of Arm who help you prove that Arm is not behind all this. The finale really is packed full of huge developments, and we're a long way from done. You stroll in on Saravok just as he's about to be crowned the Grand Duke. He eventually notices you. For such an imposing character, he's not too observant and might want to cut down on all the headgear. Here you give you a little speech and prove that Saravok is guilty. He quickly drops all pretenses, and half of the nobles in the room turn out to be doppelgangers. Saravok escapes and heads to a hidden lair under Baldur's Gate. It seems he doesn't care much about being Grand Duke anymore and is confident that enough damage has been done for his plan to go forward. Saravok is the son of Baal, the former Lord of Murder. A seer known as Alundo foresaw Baal's death, which prompted Baal to father some offspring known as Baalspawn in the hope that one of them would resurrect him. You hear these prophecies at the start of the game in Candlekeep, but it wasn't until I was going back through my video footage that I understood what they were going on about. Instead of resurrecting Baal, Saravok wants to become the new Lord of Murder, which is why he's trying to orchestrate a war between the Sword Coast and Arm. The big twist is that you are also one of the Baalspawn. Saravok wanted you out of the way in case you proved to be a complication or a rival. This is why you've spent all your life in Candlekeep, why Gorion took you into his care, and why you had to leave Candlekeep in a hurry. Whereas you were taken in by the trustworthy Gorion, Saravok was taken in by Raltar, the member of the Iron Throne you killed back in Candlekeep. Half-brother against half-brother is a somewhat boring and predictable revelation. There's an attempt to make it dramatic with Saravok fleeing to the underground city, which is separated from the Thieves Guild by a tedious maze. There are a few traps and enemies, but most of it is slowly walking down corridors. This is either to build tension before the big fight, or more likely to stop you leaving the underground city to go back and rest between fights. I tried this once and let me tell you, it takes a long time to get out of here. Perhaps BioWare felt a Dungeons & Dragons game really needed to finish off in a dungeon of sorts. At least the final battle was fitting. Saravok doesn't turn into some all-powerful god before your eyes, although his armour is a bit over the top. The fight with Saravok is an incredibly difficult fight with a couple of powerful mages there to make life difficult, but it's consistent with what we've been doing for the previous 40 or so hours. I have to confess this is another fight I slightly forced my way through. If you're very careful you can fight one of the mages without Saravok or the other mages getting involved, and then lure Saravok off by himself. The game ends when Saravok dies regardless of whether you've beaten his companions. There's only one minor defense to my actions, and that's the absence of a thief to deactivate all the traps here. I'll talk about that a bit more later. After defeating Saravok you see a statue of him collapse, and the camera pans around to reveal other statues which presumably represent other Baal spawn. Baal was a busy guy. There's an incredibly jarring moment after the credits where you're thrown straight into Siege of Dragonspear, the new game from Beamdog that plugs the gap between Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. I thought I was playing an epilogue for a few seconds.
Saravok's dead. Everything's a mess. We should have gotten out of the city days ago.
No chance of that now. But Corlage knows what she's doing and... Hey, did you hear that?
I'm going to do a separate video on Siege of Dragonspear later, but after playing Baldur's Gate for over 50 hours, not to mention time spent on other playthroughs, the last thing I wanted to do was jump into a new game. Looking back on the story, I still find it strange how quickly things ramped up from casual adventuring to taking on a Baal spawn. The two conflicting tones are a problem throughout the game. At the start you tell everyone you meet that you're just out there looking for adventures and seem relatively unconcerned with the frequent assassins who are hired specifically to kill you. There are also dark dreams with the gloomy narrator that pop up randomly and often contrast sharply with the calm campfire around which you're sleeping. These moments are here to remind you that Gorion died for a reason, to protect you. However, your protagonist just shrugs it all off. He never seems overly concerned by the assassination attempts, or the information you have about his heritage, or Gorion dying to save him. I can't help but wonder whether the grander parts of the story could have been omitted from the first half entirely. Perhaps Gorion could send you out by yourself and you don't find out he's dead until later. I'm not sure how the story benefits from knowing that you are clearly destined for something bigger right from the outset if you can't pursue those leads when talking to NPCs. This would also make the random meetings with Elminster more cryptic. It's fairly obvious your meetings are not as random as they appear and that he is the one who sent the letter to Gorion. We as the player have too much knowledge of the wider plot while the protagonist seems oblivious. The removal of the big mystery could combine with a slower ramp up towards the reveals at the end and a shift to a more serious tone that doesn't feel quite so jarring. The protagonist shouldn't be talking merrily about going on adventures when he's trying to stop a war from breaking out. The major thing lacking from Baldur's Gate's story, at least for my taste, is the ability to make choices that affect the world around you. I mentioned the choice in Cloakwood Mine where you can save the miners, leave them behind, or even deliberately drown them if you like. Unfortunately, there aren't many moments like this. Your alignment of lawful good through to chaotic evil affects which party members you can have with you and your reputation in towns. It will also dictate how you interact with NPCs. The problem is this doesn't affect the world. There's no Fallout style slideshow at the end where you're shown the consequences of your choices because you didn't have any to begin with. 5 months after the release of Baldur's Gate, BioWare released the expansion Tales of the Sword Coast. You have to do this before completing the main campaign, which is slightly awkward because the two stories are separate and represent the hardest content in the game. Going to Olgoth's Beard gives you the opportunity to learn more about Baldur, the man who Baldur's Gate is named after. There's a short mission where you'll walk to an ice island to retrieve a wizard's cloak, but the majority of the story takes place after being shipwrecked on an island while searching for the remains of Balduran's last voyage. Mendas sends you on a mission to retrieve Balduran's logbook from Balduran's wrecked ship, the Wandering Eye, and while you're there you might as well help the locals with their wolfware problem. And yes, that is wolfware, not werewolf. Wolfwares are wolves that can take human form as opposed to humans that can take wolf form. You find the Wandering Eye, but it's full of wolfwares which put up a tough fight. As discussed earlier, I never hesitated to cheese the combat where necessary, but the fights here were extreme even for me. I would try to split apart groups of enemies so I didn't have to deal with an entire floor at once, and would also rest right outside the ship between each floor and once even between battles themselves. Pretty cheap and also a clear indicator to anyone vaguely observant that perhaps I was missing something. Finally I made it to the final boss and defeated all his minions, however the boss himself, Karug, would not go down. I saw my team dealing damage and would watch as he went from uninjured to barely injured to injured, but seconds later he'd be back to uninjured again. It was at this point I suspected that maybe I needed to take a different approach.
This isn't working at all. I need to take a new tack.
I already had one weapon that did extra damage to lycanthropes, but by itself this wasn't enough to kill the creature before he healed himself. I had to find another weapon. I searched the entire island and found nothing. I worried that I might have missed the weapon from the ice island I visited previously, or was just supposed to pick it up from Olgoth's Beard before boarding the ship. However, deep down I always knew where such an important weapon would be located. Dirlag's Tower, the second major piece of content included in the expansion. Not that it mattered much because it was impossible to leave the island anyway. Before now, you'd always been able to leave an area and come back later if you were underleveled, didn't have the right spells in your inventory, wanted better equipment, or just wanted a rest. In this case, I clearly needed to get a better weapon, but I couldn't leave the island and would have to get through the fight with the weapons I already had. Switching the difficulty down to easy didn't help in any noticeable way. Karug was still able to heal before I defeated him. For the first time, I switched over to story mode and got through the fight. I guess story mode has modifiers that either help you do extra damage or stop enemies healing themselves, because otherwise, no matter how invincible I was, I wouldn't have been able to kill Karug if he just kept healing. I don't usually care all that much about what difficulty level I play at, especially when I'm learning an entirely new system like D&D. I like to experiment with difficulty settings to see how they change the experience, and there are some genres that benefit a lot from harder settings, such as survival games. Despite that, I didn't feel great about brute forcing my way through this fight on story mode. I'd come so far without it that having to admit defeat in the expansion left a sour taste in my mouth. I genuinely don't mean to offend those who play on story mode, it just felt a touch demoralising after being relatively pleased with how much I'd learnt before that. My agony was confounded when I picked up my post-battle rewards, which included the Sword of Baldur, which would inflict extra damage on, you guessed it, lycanthropes. In other words, the weapon I needed was right next to me. I suppose it's not that bad. The weapon was surrounded by traps and in a locked chest. It was clearly supposed to be a reward you claimed after the fight and not something you took before the fight, and you can use it later. After all this, you discover that the residents of the island are themselves werewolves and were hoping to escape to the mainland. You kill them before leaving on a ship, only to find out that Mendas didn't care about Balduron's journal at all. He just wanted you to help the werewolves escape the island. As little side stories go, this one is fine. Getting more backstory on Balduron is an excellent example of how to use lore to set up an interesting expansion, but the werewolf-wolfware stuff didn't do much for me. However, this is only half of the expansion. We also have Dirlag's Tower, which might represent one of the best dungeon experiences I've ever had. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't a big fan of dungeons, but that's because they often serve as an excuse to abandon storytelling and level design to shove enemies at you in corridors. That is not what Dirlag's Tower does. I was so impressed with this section that after completing it I did a quick search to see if there were videos specifically on this topic, and found a series of 5 videos by Extra Credits that discuss just the first floor of the tower. That's how good this area is. The Extra Credits guys explain it much better than I ever could, so I recommend you watch their videos. However, the gist of it is that each floor contains puzzles, combat and story, often all mixed together. A combat encounter could also be a puzzle of sorts, and a story is weaved in all the way through. The entire place is full of traps, probably too many. At a certain point, even I understand that you need someone in your party who can disarm traps. Maybe after making it through 30 of the things, Dirlag could have called it a day. Dirlag Trollkiller, to give him his full name, built the tower to provide a safe home for retirement where he hoped to start a family. Dirlag was a wealthy man, and as such, the wealth stored in the tower attracted its fair share of attention. He'd built the tower so that it couldn't be taken by brute force, however a group of doppelgangers was able to kill his family and take their place. After discovering this, Dirlag doubled down on the traps and lived out the rest of his life alone, watching those who tried to steal his treasure succumb to his brutal traps. It's a deeply personal story, and one which had much more impact than the werewolves on the island. I couldn't help but feel sorry for Dirlag, as I robbed him of everything I could carry, including a sword that would have been really useful against the wolfwares. Most of the puzzles in Dirlag's Tower are fairly straightforward. If you loot everything on each floor, then you won't go too wrong. Combat in Dirlag's Tower, however, is the most consistently challenging part of Baldur's Gate. The 4th floor of Dirlag's Tower was the other time I had to switch to story mode. I'm still not sure whether this represents a failure in my puzzle solving or combat, it's probably both. You come across a chess set where you're given a set of movement rules and told that any wrong step represents death. The rules seemed simple enough, but whenever I moved I got hit by a lightning blast or something similar. I also triggered attacks from enemies on the other side of the board, and it all quickly descended into chaos. By rushing the enemies I was able to get through with only 1 or 2 companion deaths, but I really couldn't be bothered to pick up all their gear, go back to the ground floor of the tower, go to a temple and then come all the way back again. Trying to micromanage the placement of 6 characters who all have a life of their own as soon as they see an enemy is a bit of a nightmare to say the least. The expansion comes to an end back at Olgoth's Beard, where you try and fail to prevent the ritual resurrection of demon Aklatek. This is another tough fight if you want to keep all your party alive, although given that it is the last piece of content in the story, unless you still haven't beaten Saravok, I wasn't too bothered. Aklatek is not all that tough to kill, however when you kill him he takes over the body of one of the Spellcasters. You either have to kill him multiple times or deal with the mages first. That latter option is the best, but it then becomes a frantic rush to kill everyone else while defending against spells and strong melee attacks. That brings the total to 3 fights in the expansion that were probably harder than anything in the base game, at least it was for my party. Given that the two stories in the expansion are detached from the main campaign, I would have preferred this to be post-game content to avoid the need to take a huge detour from the main questline or revert back to an old save. Completing Baldur's Gate was a long journey. Including the expansion, it took around 50 hours, which is hardly extreme for an RPG, but there was at least another 50 hours on top of that in wasted playthroughs. There's also less variety than you'd get from modern games that you could dump 100 hours into. Most of the environments are random areas of wilderness which are about as generic as they sound, and with the exception of Dirac's Tower, the dungeons are appropriately bland. This leads to Baldur's Gate feeling like a slog at times, especially in that middle act when you start to get a little tired of wandering the wilderness without getting any major story developments. Shave about 10 hours off the runtime and correct a few of the story pacing issues I discussed earlier, and I'd be recommending Baldur's Gate as a must play, even 20 years after release. It's important not to underestimate just how much there is to learn if you've never played Dungeons & Dragons. Even having taken the time to read all the rules and try to understand my decisions, I still made major mistakes, the biggest of which was my decision to dual class Imoen. When you dual class, you stop earning experience points towards your existing class, which in Imoen's case was a thief, and start earning them in a new class such as mage. Only humans can dual class, other races can multi-class. With multi-class you constantly earn XP towards all of your classes, so levelling up is slower but you are multi-skilled from the start. I wanted to try dual classing my main character, but the game threw up a bunch of warnings that made it sound like a big deal, so I wimped out and used Imoen as a guinea pig. After dual classing into a mage, Imoen not only stopped earning XP towards the thief class, she also stopped being able to use her thief abilities. She gets them back when her mage level is one level above her thief level, but that takes a while. This meant I had no way to use her thief abilities such as lockpicking and detecting and deactivating traps. I could live without the lockpicking. I already had a lot of money and found the rewards from locked chests to be disappointing most of the time. I didn't need to detect traps because Jaheira could do that with a spell and then the party could just walk around it. Unless they couldn't. Near the end of the story, the absence of a thief in my party became painfully obvious. There are corridors with traps that you simply can't avoid regardless of whether you can see them or not. This is one of the reasons the last boss was so tough. There are traps all over the place and it's hard not to stumble into them. This is probably the most obvious thing anyone has ever said when discussing a Dungeons & Dragons based RPG, but please make sure you keep a thief with you at all times. It'll make your life a lot easier. I still want to dual class my protagonist, but I have no idea when to do that. I'll probably import the character into Baldur's Gate 2 and dual class from the start to see how it goes. Most players will have a moment like this, something that reminds you just how little you actually understand even after 30 hours. Regardless of little teething problems here and there, I still recommend you play Baldur's Gate if you have the time. When recommending games in this series on CRPGs, I assume you already have a huge list of games demanding your attention, otherwise I'd probably recommend all of them for historical importance alone. That's why I picked these games to play in the first place after all. That said, the presence of story mode plus the quality of life tweaks are enough to make Baldur's Gate an easier game to recommend than the first two Fallouts. The Enhanced Edition is regularly on sale on GOG and Steam for $10 and goes down to $5 as well sometimes. In my video on Metro 2033, I talked at length about the feeling of immersion I experienced while playing. Metro 2033 put me in the shoes of the protagonist and made me feel like I was part of the world. Baldur's Gate doesn't immerse me in this way. There's too much that gets in the way of connecting to my character, such as the lack of character and companion dialogue, the isometric viewpoint, and tedious combat. Instead, Baldur's Gate was immersive in the same way as a good book. It's a softer level of immersion, but still a special one. It's the small touches like the detailed journal that keeps track of my activities, the way you treat your team to a luxurious room for the night after a tough battle, the fire burning as you sleep, and even the way you slowly clear the fog of war while exploring. I'm immersed in the adventure, if not the character. I'm excited to return to the Forgotten Realm with Siege of Dragonspear and eventually dive into the infamous Baldur's Gate 2. For years I've heard people talk about how great Baldur's Gate 2 is without so much as a mention of its predecessor. It was as if the first game didn't exist. Yes, combat in Baldur's Gate is dull at times and the story suffers both from a lack of meaningful choice and consistent themes, but it really is worth playing and I hope some of you consider giving it a shot. As you know, this series on the history of isometric CRPGs is being done in chronological order to properly track changes to the genre over the years. That puts me in a slightly tricky position for Siege of Dragonspear, which was released in 2016 but takes place between Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. It seems silly to delay Siege until I get to the modern era, especially when I've heard that the transition from Baldur's Gate 1 to the sequel was a bit rough. Therefore I'm going to do a video on Siege of Dragonspear next in this series, but treat it as episode 3.5 or something like that. Hell, maybe I'll go full Kingdom Hearts with the naming and call it Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear Retrospective, a history of isometric CRPGs, episode 3.5 HD, Baldur's Gate Epilogue, Baldur's Gate 2 Prologue. Oh, and over 2. I like catchy titles. Whatever I call it, the video will likely be shorter than this one. I'm mainly covering it for completeness. After that it's Planescape Torment. I'm alternating videos in the Isometric CRPG series with standard critiques to make sure I don't get all Isometric CRPG'd out. I'm not going to disclose what the next critique video will be because I'm still deciding between two, but I'm fairly sure you're going to like it. Whatever it ends up being, it's one that's been requested many times in comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe share the video if you know an audience that might be interested. This legitimately makes a huge difference to how successful any given video is and ultimately the future of the channel, so I'd appreciate it. I do have a Patreon now, so if you could throw $1 my way, that would also be great. There is only one reward tier. At $1 a month you get your name in the credits. Those who give more might get more prominence, but otherwise you'll get the same thing regardless of the amount you give. I explain my reasoning for this in more detail on the Patreon page. Thank you very much to everyone who has given me money so far and those who will do so in the future. It is becoming increasingly clear that this channel only has a long-term future through donations, so it makes a huge difference. Commenting is also insanely helpful, and I'm supposed to ask you questions to drive engagement. I don't know, how about you try and guess what game you think the next major critique video will be on? A couple of clues. The two I'm deciding between are both sci-fi based, the first in a series and more than 10 years old. Oh, and both franchises have enthusiastic fans who also get angry at said franchise. You know what, that last one doesn't narrow it down much, does it? Okay, that's about it from me. In September I plan to stream Spider-Man, Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Red Dead Redemption, plus whatever else catches my eye. Please consider stopping by the streams to hang out and ask questions. Until next time, cheers.